Russo friends, welcome back to Opus Elenae, where we haven't done a tutorial in a while, have we? Historical costuming is intimidating. I know that sounds disingenuous coming from me, but it's true. There aren't a lot of pre-made patterns available, fabric is expensive and confusing, sewing machines are loud and fast and potentially fatal, and sewing by hand is boring and slow. Well, I'm not so sure I agree on that last bit. Yes, sewing by hand is slower than a machine, but because of that, you have a lot more control over your stitches. When you make a mistake on a machine, you f up on fast forward. Today, I'm going to show you 3 historical hand sewing stitches, plus a bonus one at the end, suitable for making clothing from the Bronze Age all the way through to modern couture. So everyone go grab your cuppa. Today, I'm actually just drinking some water. I have been feeling both dehydrated and uninspired by my tea cabinet, which is actually an impressive feat considering the size of it. So I'm actively soliciting tea suggestions from all of you. Tell me what I should be checking out down in the comments. Extra credit for small business recommendations. In the meantime, let's get into it. The first stitch is going to seem like a complete gimme. Yes, I'm talking about the running stitch. It's the basic stitch that everyone learns first, the platonic ideal of sewing. Simply put, the needle travels from one side of the fabric through to the other, back and forth. It creates a dashed line of thread on both sides. This stitch is incredibly easy and very quick since you can take several stitches on the needle at once by rocking the fabric back and forth before pulling the thread through. Sewing this way pushes the thread through on a slight diagonal, which can make it easier for fabric to slide along the thread. This is great when you're making gathers or pleats, but if you're sewing seams, it's a good idea to keep an eye on the thread tension to make sure you're not pulling it too tight and puckering the seam. If you want a better chance of avoiding that, you can take each stitch individually with the needle perpendicular to the fabric. This creates a bit more friction with a sharper angle, but it is slower. There's a perception that the running stitch isn't sturdy, and I don't think that's strictly accurate. I think there's 2 factors that go into it. First, beginners tend to take larger stitches, and that leads to fewer points of connection between 2 pieces of fabric. That seam is going to pull apart under tension and feel very unstable. Smaller stitches mean more and closer connection points and a more stable seam. Secondly, unlike other stitches that can stretch with fabric cut on the bias, running stitch has no give at all, so it will break instead of stretch. This means the running stitch is good for seams that don't take a lot of strain or tension and aren't expected to bend and stretch with bias cut fabric. The second stitch I want to show you is the back stitch. This one is a little weird because even though the needle is pointing in the same direction that the seam is being sewn, each stitch individually is worked in the opposite direction. So one single stitch is taken with the needle coming up at the side of the stitch further away from the previous stitch and coming down on the closer side. Because backstitch is a series of stitches taken in the opposite direction as the seam is being sewn, it creates a dashed line on one side of the fabric and a kind of semi-twisted looking stitch pattern where the threads slightly overlap each other on the other side. Backstitch is slower than running since only one stitch can be taken at a time, but it is very sturdy. And because it's basically a series of loops, it's more elastic and better suited for seams that have some stretch. There is a middle ground here though, the combination stitch. It's not even really worth its own section. It's basically a running stitch with a backstitch every now and then to anchor the seam. Generally, I will do one kind of needle's worth of running stitches and then start the next series of running stitches with one backstitch. I find it just as quick as a running stitch and is my go-to for things like skirt seams. Our third stitch is the felling stitch, also called a hem stitch. You have seen me use this one extensively on this channel since it's my preferred method for hemming, seam finishing, and any sort of applique. This stitch is designed to be minimally visible from the right side with a series of diagonal lines of thread on the other. When hemming, I fold the edge of the fabric up once and then again, encasing the raw edge inside the hem folds. When finishing seams, I will cut one side of seam allowance down by about half, then fold the other allowance over the first before laying it flat against the garment fabric. Then I'll start felling. In both of these instances, I want the stitches to be least visible on the side away from the fold or seam. So with the inside facing me, I'll take one tiny stitch perpendicular to the fold through the main fabric first and then catching the very edge of the folded fabric. I will repeat that stitch anywhere from 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch, 1/3 to 2/3 centimeters away, depending on the delicacy of the fabric and how many anchoring points I feel like it needs. When looking at the outside of the fabric, you can see that the stitches are super tiny and nearly invisible, and on the inside you see the diagonal threads that I was referring to earlier. Because this stitch is almost a spiral, it also has a little give, so it can stretch just a bit around curves. When doing something like securing a neckline facing, which is basically applique, I still want the stitches to be minimally visible on the outside, but this time I'll work with the right side of the garment facing me. To create the felling stitch from outside, the needle will create the diagonal stitch on the underside rather than the tiny perpendicular stitch. So to begin, the needle will come up from the underside of the garment, catching the fold of the fabric created by turning the raw edge underneath. Then I'll insert the needle on the garment fabric, creating the tiny perpendicular stitch, and bring it back up a little further along, again catching the edge of the facing fold. Repeat as necessary. When sewing something like a neckline facing, which has parts that are straight and parts that curve fairly sharply, I'll try to space my stitches more closely together around the curves just to make sure they're very secure. Thank you to all of my current and continuing Ko-fi members. Your support makes it easier to provide quality content for everyone. If sneak peeks, early ad-free video access, monthly vlog life updates, or a dedicated virtual sewing circle sounds interesting to you, check out my Ko-fi memberships. Thank you so much to everyone who has already joined. Stick around after this brief commercial break for that bonus stitch I mentioned earlier. I promised a bonus stitch, and here it is, the Overcast Stitch, also known as the whip stitch. This is designed to do two things, either to butt two edges of fabric together or to encase the edges of fabric, which may or may not have been seamed with another stitch. In some ways, it's very similar to the felling stitch in that the thread forms kind of a spiral, but where the felling stitch alternates between a straight stitch and a steeply diagonal stitch, the Overcast Stitch has diagonal stitches of similar angle on both front and back sides. To sew two pieces of fabric together, hold the right sides together and insert the needle through the very edge of the pieces at about a 45-degree angle. Pull the thread through, taut but not tight, and then do the same thing again, far enough along the seam that the thread will form that same 45-degree angle. If you need to, you can hold the thread along the seam to figure out where to insert the needle, and you'll fall into a rhythm soon enough. Once you're done sewing the seam, gently pull the pieces of fabric apart, wiggling and zhuzhing until the two pieces lay side by side, ends butted. This is where tension really makes a difference. I suggest waiting to tie off the thread until after this process, just in case you need to loosen or tighten things. This application of the Overcast Stitch can be used on the selvage edges of fabric, on fold wool that won't ravel, on two already hemmed pieces of fabric, or on two fully lined garment pieces that need to be sewn together. The other way the stitch is used is to encase raw edges of fabric. There are medieval veils that have the edges rolled over and secured with an overcast stitch, something I haven't tried yet, but I really want to. And that would work just as well for any fabric edge that doesn't have a ton of stress on it. It can also be used as a seam finish. Raw seam allowances can be overcasted to keep the fabric from unraveling. If you want to really be fancy, you can lay a matching or contrasting yarn along the raw edges before overcasting. This also works with felling seam allowances that would be too bulky if folded over. It adds a nice decorative touch, and the yarn also protects the raw edges from friction. I hope this video has been both informative and enjoyable, and of course, if it has inspired you to create something, I'd love to see it. And if you enjoy this channel and want to support it, you can do that completely for free by sharing this or any of my videos with friends and social media. Also, you should definitely come join the Discord. It's full of fantastic people. If you're looking for more hand sewing tutorials, check out this video where I teach you 2 other ways to sew a rolled hem. Until next time, be kind, do the work, continue supporting marginalized people, and keep creating. Quill.